Welcome to NYS PowHer's Women's Equality Wednesday Google Hangout. I'm Beverly Neufeld, and I'm founder of NYS PowHer and director of the Equal Pay Coalition of New York. We're very excited to be moderating the Equal Pay panel today. If you're watching, please tweet comments and questions using the hashtag PowHerList. After the event, this Google Hangout will be available at nyspowher.org. We are an inclusive statewide network committed to securing economic equality for all New York women. That is why each Wednesday through the election we are holding conversations on key issues which affect women's economic equality. And we have some experts here, which are flashing across our screen, to talk to us about that. Please note that NYS PowHer is strictly nonpartisan, and the comments of our guests do not represent those of the organization necessarily. Well, let's get started. Yesterday there was a Gallup poll that was released, and it identifies equal pay as the top issue for working women. By 41% of women agree to that, and 37% of all American men. It is the top choice of liberals, moderates, and conservatives. With all that support, how are we going to make equal pay a reality in New York and the United States, and are we at a tipping point? So here to discuss this are my Google Hangout guests, Phoebe Taubman, who is a senior staff attorney for A Better Balance. Phoebe, welcome. Rosa Cho, happy to have you here. Rosa Cho, who is a policy research analyst for Ray Gender, which is formerly the National Council for Research on Women. As well, we have Fatina Goss-Graves, who is VP of Education and Employment at the National Women's Law Center. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Fatima, we're going to start with you. I don't think the audience is aware that you have just swooped in because there are some warnings of a tornado in Washington, D.C. So thank you, for fighting the elements to be with us today. Fatima, here in New York, we have moved in a very short time from struggling to get any attention at all to equal pay issues to being really front and center as a key provision of Governor Cuomo's Women's Equality Act. It's a provision like the one that your organization has been trying to push, and it's modeled after the Paycheck Fairness Act. It has worker retaliation protections and other loophole protections. Can you explain to us why it is so important that we have these protections for workers, and how will that impact equal pay and ultimately equal opportunity economically?
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. Just last month, the U.S. Census released the latest data on the wage gap, and what we learned is that women were making 78 cents of the dollar when compared to men, and that for some groups of women of color, that gap was extremely large. For African American women, it was 64 cents compared to the wages of typically made by white men. And for Latina women, it was 56 cents. And so those are the sorts of statistics that really shock the conscience. And there's a wage gap in nearly every occupation, whether you're talking about some of the lowest paid jobs or at the C-suite. And when you put all of that together, and the fact that we're dealing with around 50 years of laws that ban discrimination in employment, including pay discrimination, it outrages people, the idea that people working the same job could be paid less, and that we don't have strong enough laws to do something about it. So the two key provisions that are in New York and that are also in the Paycheck Fairness Act would help put some tools in place so that our pay discrimination laws were meaningful. The first one would ensure there's a little bit more sunlight on what happens in pay practices. I mean, part of the reason that women end up being paid less is that employers can get away with it. So what the basic provision would say is that you could talk about your wages without having a penalty. And we know from research by IWPR and others that more than half of private sector workers say that they can be penalized if they talk about their wages. The flip side of that is that if employers know that their employees may have essential conversations, they're more likely to take steps in the front end to do the right thing and do their own self-analysis and try to keep a pay gap in the same workplace from happening. But the second thing is that we have a real deterrence problem. We have a problem in that everyone knows, including employers, that our pay discrimination laws have some real holes. And that right now in New York and in most places around the country, there is no clear rule that you have to have a business justification for paying men and women doing the same jobs different wages. And again, that's another basic thing, that you should not be able to pay two different people doing the same thing different wages without a real business justification. And so the New York provisions would go a long way to making sure that there was more sunlight so that people had the right sort of information both at an employee and employer level, but also that there's a little bit of more deterrence so that if an employer does violate the law, you can do something about it.
Thank you so much for that extremely concise explanation of something that's actually very complicated. Thank you, Fatima.
Yes.
So, Phoebe, Fatima's describing one way that employers discriminate against women and some of the protections that can be put in place when the Women's Equality Act is passed and the Paycheck Fairness Act is passed. And I want to note that a better balance was a key force in the inclusion of that anti-retaliation measure in WEA. But you also have been working on another really important law, and that is pregnancy accommodations, accommodating women when they're pregnant. So that is also a provision of the Women's Equality Act. How does pregnancy and motherhood affect women's economic status and opportunity, Phoebe, and how does this play out in the workplace?
Well, thanks again for having me. It's a really key trigger for a lot of the inequality we're talking about, because the wage gap is complex. You know, it's cumulative, it snowballs over time, and a lot of that is because of the roles women do over the course of their working lives as mothers and caregivers. So the first point of that is pregnancy. And see still blatant pregnancy discrimination. We hear from a lot of women on our hotline about it, where just announcing their pregnancy, they're fired, even though that's been outlawed for over 35 years. And then when they have to the workplace, you know, there's all sorts of consequences thereafter, losing pay, having trouble getting back. And accommodations is sort of an issue we've been focusing on the last few years, where women want to continue working, and they just need some small change to their workplace or hours or the way in which they work in order to maintain a healthy pregnancy while also staying employed. When they ask for such an accommodation, their employers react by saying, "Oh, well, you know, be here anymore. You're not, can't do the job. We'll just push you out entirely." Or it's onto unpaid leave that lasts indefinitely, or just out of the job. And when that happens, again, women are losing income. They find it hard to get back into the workplace because employers are reluctant to hire a visibly pregnant woman. And then, this sort of falls into lifelong economic disadvantage. So the provision of the Women's Equality Act that you mentioned tries to get at this by requiring employers to consider requests for reasonable accommodation from women, and to provide those accommodations unless they pose a severe burden on the employer's business. And we think it's a pretty sort of common idea that pregnant women should deserve the same treatment that our law provides for disabled workers who need some modest adjustment to work, and it would allow them to stay at the force and earning those wages that keep them on a trajectory and in their career, and losing ground by being pushed out. So I think that's one piece, and then just to others, quickly, the Women's Equality Act also includes a family status discrimination, which would get at the bias in employment against mothers, but also for people who are in caregiving relationships at the state level. It's about parenthood in particular. And so, you know, there have been studies done to show that mothers actually are less qualified for certain positions versus women without children. One study, participants had identical resumes, and there was only differentiated by the status of each applicant. One was a mother and one wasn't. And the mother was recommended for a much lower starting salary than the non-mother, and also less likely to be hired. So this is a problem also for economic inequality if we're having trouble in the workplace overcoming that bias. And finally, the last thing I wanted to mention here is paid leave, which is so important. You know, a lot of women in the workplace have paid leave to be able to recover from childbirth and bond with a new baby. And again, that ending that they are forced to quit. You know, half of women with less than a high school education, they quit their jobs because they didn't have paid leave and had really no other choice in order to be home early days of recovery and bonding with their baby. And again, those separations from work are really critical because they can lead to a lifetime of economic disadvantage. You know, one study said basically time out of the workforce without being, you know, in school can lead to a wage decline over 22 months of 11%. So this is really a big problem, these forces that are pushing women out in terms of equality.
Thank you much for explaining that, Phoebe. You know, certainly with the effort, this PowHer List campaign, we're trying to point out that all of these issues are really connected to each other. And certainly we have talked about paid family leave, but it is absolutely part of people getting equal pay as well. You know, so this is an interconnected problem, and the solutions are too. So now we get to something that I think is a little bit more difficult, because here we have some solutions in place for some of the problems, you know, that you have both described, Fatima and Phoebe. And it will get at a stubborn wage gap. By the way, in New York, it is lower. It's a smaller wage gap for women in New York, if they're white, than across the country. But Hispanic women and African American women still have a very large wage gap in New York, as they do across the country. What we need to get to, I think, is the fact that women do women's work, and women's work is undervalued and it's underpaid. So our first hangout, we had Ellen Bravo, and she asked the question, why are women who take care of our children getting paid less than men who are taking care of our lawns and buildings? And so I turn to you, Ray. Gender is looking at issues like this. And can you talk about how systemic sexism and discrimination are affecting women's economic opportunity and fairness?
Sure. Thank you, Beverly, for invitation for this wonderful event. We believe that unequal pay really is a highly gendered process, and that we should look at it by examining first the social construction of so-called women's work and the devaluation of women's labor in general that usually accompanies it, and the perceived gender identities of workers. So first, when we look at the type of work that women and girls are pushed into or pulled into or get kicked out of, and also combined with that, look at the financial values that are attached to those jobs. It's easy to see that some of the jobs that women are getting into, the pink-collar jobs, low-wage jobs that are predominantly female occupation jobs, are pretty just there's a lot of science to be talked about, but I think the crux of the issue is that women are getting into the female-dominated jobs, but after all, like there's no problem with men doing male-dominated jobs. So the issue is that predominantly female-dominated jobs are very low-paid, and why is that? And I think one of the areas that we we need to examine is the care work, because care work has long been deemed as the women's work, and that's actually across the board of like whether we're looking at high-end or mid-wage jobs like nursing, social work, or therapy work, to the low-end work is in the wage staffing work and domestic work. So these jobs are these caring jobs that are very intense, labor-intensive, and really tough. Are very low paid. And why is that? I think the driving force behind all this is that care work is somehow deemed as less skilled, less deserving of high pay, because they're supposed to be the nurturing jobs or the mothering kind of jobs that women do so naturally. And because of this presumption, it's also kind of tacitly assumed that women who are, usually women who are working in these industries are not expected to negotiate for higher pay or demand better working conditions. So the end result, I think, is that we're living in the economic structure that decides to pay, for example, social workers or home health aides who do incredibly difficult and hard work. Say the national average rates of hourly rates of less than $27 for social workers and $10.60 for home health aides. So it is that kind of devaluation of work that women tend to perform that are pushed into and the link to pay inequity. The second level is the gender element of the worker itself, and how the gender plays roles in how people evaluate your work and how much you should be compensated. And researchers have long been known that women's work, first of all, women earn less even in female-dominated occupations. We have long known that. The second is that women's work somehow gets evaluated and performed, it's just devalued and perceived as inferior in quality for some reason by both men and women assessors. So that's something to be talked about in terms of how one's work is performed and it's evaluated. I think that gets into play of how you are getting paid for the same kind of, presumably the same kind of work. If you're a male person, you just get more for some reason. And women are willing to say that too. So, and finally, I would like to actually mention a small study that is very fascinating that was published in 2008. The researchers for this study surveyed 43 transgender workers, people who transitioned from male to female and female to male workers, and basically they found that on average, the earnings of male to female workers fell by almost 1/3. Their earnings changed quite significantly after they transitioned into women. And female to male workers, on the other hand, their incomes went up a little bit by 10%, I believe. So these kinds of findings kind of indicate to us that gender plays quite significant roles in how your work is, our work is evaluated and how much we're getting paid.
Right. Well, thank you so much for that, Rosa. It's a very difficult issue to get at. In New York State, we have been working on it through the New York State Fair Pay Act since 2002, and that has looked at evaluating work and equal pay for work of equivalent value. So, but there's a huge market out there of women working independently, and they would not be affected by that. So it's a tough one. That is really, sort of a much tougher question, and it's hard to find the solutions for. But we do have solutions, at least, for some of the problems. And Fatima, I'm going to circle back to you, because here we have a lot of potential and possibility, with the equal pay bills that we're talking about. What do you see happening nationally, and what do you think would happen if and when New York passes a bill like the Paycheck Fairness Act? Will that have an impact?
So the first thing I want to make sure that people know is that there is some movement happening nationally. I know it feels sometimes like the complete gridlock, but the administration right now has 2 equal pay executive orders that are open for public comment. And that public comment period is happening now, where people can weigh in on a ban on retaliation policies that federal contractors may have, and on providing data by race and by gender of pay practices. So those are two key components that are happening at a national level. And there has been a vote on the Paycheck Fairness Act as recently as last first time in the Senate, cloture, which is the procedural move that you ultimately we did not have enough to actually have a vote on the bill, an up or down vote on the bill, but we were actually able for the first time in the Senate to have a real debate. So there is progress, however small. But one of the things that I think has helped that progress at the national stage is that a number of states have been taking these bills and moving them and showing that it's possible. New Hampshire this past year, Minnesota passed an equal pay bill as a part of its broader women's equality package. Mm-hmm. New Mexico states to move some things next year. So again, it's possible to do these sort of common sense measures.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, we hope that we'll add New York to that list. And the good news is that in our New York State Senate, there was a unanimous vote in favor, you know, of this equal pay kind of provisions. So, you know, that means both sides of the aisle are coming together, and whether they know we're all coming for this and we want this to happen, or whatever the motivation is, we are very thrilled that that happened. Now we have to get the whole act passed, but still, that was super significant. You know, Phoebe, so with the pregnancy and motherhood penalties, you know, how do we get at that and nationally? Is there a movement, you know, for government and business to deal with these issues? Phoebe?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is national level and in many states and localities. So at the national level, there's a bill called the Pregnancy Fairness Act that was introduced in Congress, and we're working hard to get that bill through. As Fatima said, sometimes, you know, federal government moves a little bit more slowly, so we've been working on similar laws across the country where they've been passed in New Jersey and West Virginia, where here in New York City, we helped to get such a law passed, and it went in January of 2014, so we're working on enforcement now and making sure that women understand their right to exercise them. So we're definitely seeing progress. And on the motherhood issue, again, you know, that's a piece of the Women's Equality Act, so hopefully when the whole 10 passed, you know, we'll see progress at the state level. And also for paid family New York state level, that's something that New York is perfectly positioned to be the next stop paid family leave. First was California, and then New Jersey, and then most recently Rhode Island. And in New York, we've got the whole infrastructure already set up and ready to go. We just need the political votes to make it happen. So we're really excited about that as another step toward carving away at the motherhood wage gap when we get that passed in New York. And, you know, in this, we've got earned sick time passed last year. That makes a big difference for a woman who's caring to be able to stay home with them when they're sick and not fear for losing her job or a day's pay. So it's definitely gaining momentum, often at the state and local level, and we're really excited about that.
Right. That has been amazing work. That it was done in New York, and it's important for us to realize that we are making progress, and the New York City law is certainly one of those pieces. Rosa, I think my question for you is the toughest, you know, because we're talking about culture shift. Do you have any thoughts on how we make that sort of cultural shift so that women's work is not undervalued and therefore underpaid?
It is the toughest. I think it is a very tough question, and unless we have the paradigm shift on understanding why we end up paying people who take care of our elderly parents, our children, so poorly, I think that's something that every individual has to ask themselves. I think research has shown that unionization of workers do help a lot. I mean, unionization helps a lot. So that's something that workers and there's a lot of exciting movements around the domestic workers. So that's something to look forward to, I think. But I think what's important is individually teaching ourselves, teaching others about the kind of work that we as a society values. And I mean, not just values in like heart and, heartwarming level, but pays. Because, it's ultimately about getting the fair share of the economic pie, right? Yeah, so those are some of my thoughts.
Helpful. Thank you. And it is a tough question. I think we're all going to have to deal with that. It's the next round of issues that we do need to take care of, especially with the numbers of women in poverty. So, so as a final rapid round, the purpose of our getting together for these hangouts is to encourage people to speak up about what's on their power list and how they want to move this agenda forward around women's economic equality. So let me just ask our guests today, what are your thoughts on how do we move this? What are your suggestions for actions that people can take, so that we can, create equal pay within a short time, certainly within our lifetime. So, Fatima, you want to start with that? We'll just go through.
Sure. I mean, I love the idea of the power list because I think this panel shows that addressing things like pay discrimination and pregnancy discrimination and occupational segregation, they have to happen in a package. And I think people need to make noise about that, make noise with their representatives and members of Congress, make noise in the media. Equal pay is an issue that's finally at the forefront. We need to keep it there.
Great. Thank you. Phoebe, what are your last thoughts?
Well, I would echo what Fatima believe that politicians don't respond unless they feel pressure, and their constituents are a point of pressure for them. So, this constituency of working mothers that we work with, busy group of people, and it's often hard to find time to get engaged, but I urge people to, make noise, let their electeds know this is something they care about, and ask them what they're doing. Put them on the spot and accountable.
Right. Just one more job for busy women, right? And being
One though. Yeah.
Rosa.
Yeah. I also recommend the joint action. I believe in connecting different stakeholders and also practical solutions that are evidence-based and that can end all forms of gender inequity. That would be my power list.
Right. Item. So we have, as a society, a lot to think about and challenge, but we are moving forward, which is this exciting part. Honestly, we could not get the attention to this issue a number of years ago, and suddenly everyone is talking about equal pay. So that's definitely progress in the right direction. I want to thank our amazing panel today for being part of this NYS PowHer Google Hangout. You just have a wealth of knowledge, and your organizations are doing cutting-edge work, on this, and we all thank you for that. So to our viewers, we have heard some powerful comments about obstacles and solutions, and some great ideas for taking action. So we want you to ask your elected official or candidates, what are they going to do about what's on your power list and on economic equality for women? Stay connected with NYS PowHer so you can loop into all the activities we'll be doing. And of course, vote on November 4th after you've looked at the candidates. And after that, make sure they hear from you. So thank you for tuning into this Women's Equality Wednesday. And I'm very excited about next week on October 22nd, same station, online. We're going to be talking about having women represented at all tables and how that creates economic opportunity. And our guests will be the Chief Diversity Officer for New York State, and Catalyst. So I want to thank you, and I guess together we can power on. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.